So actually, this is a pretty special set because we chose this set after taking a lot of inputs from different people. People who gave CAT 2021, people who will be giving CAT 2022. So we decided that this would be a fun study. So let's get on with it. As the study of rhetoric enters the 21st century, the definition of what constitutes a rhetorical text has changed. So, the first line of the RC itself gives us the context that the RC is about how rhetoric and the study and rhetorical study has changed over time, especially in the 21st century. So, when you read a line like this, so you should anticipate that the next line would talk about how it has changed or what would be the consequences. So this will enable you to form a flow of thought so that you don't have to come back again and again to read the same paragraph twice. First thing I have registered is that it is talking about rhetoric and the study of rhetoric. Now let's look at the second line. The internet and other visual media have invaded our society and are demanding attention from rhetorical scholars. So now the author is talking about how it has evolved. And the reason is that the internet, the proliferation of the internet and other visual media have changed the very nature of rhetoric. And because of this, this has gained the attention of rhetorical scholars. So first is the topic, the point of contention of the author. And the second is why this thing has actually happened. Let's continue. The 21st century has developed a new consumer that is bombarded with thousands upon thousands of visual images on a daily basis. Consumers, as well as critics, are in need of an approach by which to critically evaluate the persuasive strategies used in these messages. Now, the author is trying to make a point here. The first thing he did was he introduces the topic, then he tells us how it has changed, and now he is trying to impress the gravity of the situation, how important the situation is. So he's saying that in in this 21st century, the new consumer is bombarded with thousands of visual images. So it is very important. So the study of these visual images is very important for not only for the consumer to make sense of what is happening, but also for the person who's actually sending out these messages. So now the author has made us hooked because now we feel that this is a very important topic to discuss. Now let's look at the last line of the paragraph. Utilizing the method of strategic visual message design will lead not only to the creation of better visuals, but also to a better understanding of the visuals that persuade us every day. Again, the author is buttressing the point that study of visuals and visual rhetoric will be very important in the coming times. So there are some things that we need to note here. The first thing is that I don't know the meaning of rhetoric. Okay. After reading this one paragraph, I did not come to know what rhetoric means. And honestly, you don't need to know that because many a times there will be certain terms used in the passage that you will have no idea what they mean. So one point that should be noted here is that vocabulary, though is important, it is not ultra important. The only thing that you need to know is that there is some term, some X term by the name of rhetoric, and the author is talking about it, why it is important, how it has changed, and why the study of rhetoric is important. The meaning of rhetoric itself is not important at this point of time. So moving forward to the second paragraph, rhetorical analysis has evolved so that no longer is discourse limited to the medium of the spoken word. So we can infer that for a long part of rhetorical analysis, it was based only on spoken word. And now it has evolved to a more visual nature. So these are the small things that you should pick up from the after reading each paragraph. That rhetorical analysis was subjected only to spoken word till now, but now it has evolved to a more visual nature. This is one point that I would register immediately in my mind. The conception of rhetoric as a purely verbal text in which public controversy primarily took oral or written form is fading. Rhetoric can and is being created and recorded in the dialects of marble, steel, clay, glass, paper, and ink, not to mention oils, pastels, and acrylics. Now, you can see that there is a huge connection between what the author said before and what he's trying to impress us with now. He's saying that the written form and the spoken form is fading, which means that not only is the visual rhetoric evolving, it is also obscuring this older form. It means that the oral and written form is not of super importance right now. Visual rhetoric is becoming more and more important. Then he's talking about different ways in which visual rhetoric is being created. They're saying that there are dialects of marble, steel, clay, glass, paper, and ink. He's just talking about different ways in which artwork is expressed here. Visual rhetoric or visual messages are expressed here. Studying visual imagery and art from a rhetorical perspective gives scholars a more complete and richer understanding of the rhetorical process because it offers explanation of all the symbols that surround us, not just the verbal ones. Here you can see that the author is following a very specific way of communication. The author is first making a point, and then he's trying to impress us with how important the point is. First, he said that the evaluation of these visual rhetorics will be very important when we are bombarded with visual messages. And now in the second paragraph, he's saying that this is important so that we make sense of the symbols that are present around us. Author makes a point, and then he tries us to impress with how important that point. Visual rhetoric has traditionally suffered from a lack of study because traditional rhetoric scholars have historically believed that visual rhetoric is less important than verbal communication. Now, author is taking a different approach. First, he was trying to say that how important visual rhetoric is by how it should be used and this all. Now he has taken, going into the finer details. Now he's saying that why visual rhetoric is not believed to be as good as other forms of rhetoric. Now he's saying that traditionally people avoided studying about visual rhetoric because they believe that it is less important than verbal communication. Now what they're trying to say is that let's say there are big banners on display. They convey some visual messages. They were not studied as much because people believe that the things that you say, they have a much more stronger impression on the people, on the listeners, than a poster on a banner would have on them. Now the author has already hinted that now this is changing and people are believing that these banners, these posters are even more important than what we say. So some scholars of rhetoric and contemporary culture believe that imagery as a rhetorical form is tainted as compared to discourse and the effects it produces on the nature of public communication and modes of critical processing it engenders in audiences. Now the author is delving into more finer details. Now he's saying that some scholars of rhetoric believe that imagery as a rhetorical form is not that good. So now I will try to explain you what rhetoric actually is so that you can make sense of this sentence. It is not important, but I just want you to know. So rhetoric is just a means of persuasion. Okay, that how saying some words in some specific manner so that the other person forms a specific impression. So there are many speeches. You must have heard Barack Obama speaking, Nelson Mandela speaking. They do not say any different words, but the way they phrase them and their tonality, their modality, this causes people to cheer for them, people to vote for them. And that is rhetoric. Many scholars have defined visual artifacts to be of lesser value than verbal communication because they claim that visual rhetoric shortchanges public argument. Now, the author has again thrown around some very heavy phrases like shortchanging public argument. Okay. Now, personally, I do not know what short changes means exactly. So I will just leave it. But let me give you a hint beforehand that this will come as a question. And then I will show you then that if you don't know the meaning of a phrase, how can you infer what the answer is? So scholars in communication studies and in other fields have examined the visual through the application of the Gestalt principles. Now I will leave this part out because as of now we do not need to know the meaning of Gestalt principles. It would only complicate what we are trying to understand here. Let's see if we can make it to the next paragraph without understanding what Gestalt principles actually mean and applied them to the organization of visual materials. Now, the author is just saying that there are some Gestalt principles that scholars have applied to come to sense with what actually visual rhetoric is. Okay. This approach seems to be practical because principles are viewed as axiomatic by researchers to be universal in nature. Now, again, you do not need to derive any meaning from here. The only thing that you have to see here is that application of Gestalt principle is quite practical and is universal in nature. The Gestalt principles are tools that are undoubtedly understood by the rhetor or designer, but are generally not consciously comprehended by the audience. Now, this is a very fairly easy sentence, but this is something that you must be focusing on. that Gestalt principles are very esoteric in nature. Now, esoteric means that something that is understood by a very few people. Now, you can say that the author is trying to impress that Gestalt principles, the people who are making these visual rhetorics, they understand these principles, but the audience themselves do not understand that. So again, this implies some sort of manipulation going on. The author is not outright saying it, but he's trying to imply that people who are making these visual messages, they understand, but the audience doesn't. So they have an upper hand over the audience. So this is the main point that the author is trying to convey here. Now, the last paragraph, one area that has examined the visual is the field of aesthetics. Now, one more thing that you need to keep in mind is visual rhetoric, and everything else that the author is saying about visual material in this, these mean the same thing. So even if the author has admitted rhetoric from here, he means the same thing only. You should not get confused with that. He has introduced another branch of philosophy, that is aesthetics. Now, even if you don't know the meaning of aesthetics, you can still answer this question. However, many perspectives that are used in the aesthetic judging of imagery are not useful in the rhetorical evaluation of images because they overlook the audience and the context of the artifact. The only point that you need to take from here is that author has a negative connotation attached to this aesthetics. He feels that the field of aesthetics is not that good when it comes to visual rhetoric because it does not give much weight to how the audience is feeling or what the context of the artifact is. For example, one perspective of the evaluation of visual imagery in aesthetic defines judgment of quality solely as idiosyncratic responses. Judgments about quality means simply preference rooted in individual whim or fancy. Another perspective is based on the concept that there can be a set of unique criteria for aesthetics. But these types of approaches do not particularly help us understand the potential persuasiveness of a particular artifact or how they function rhetorically. Again, you can see that author is again trying to attach a negative connotation to the field of aesthetics. There are 4 questions after this reading comprehension. I will try to answer that without going back to the passage itself, okay, if possible. So the first question is the main idea of the passage. So the main idea questions you should be able to answer without going back to the passage. If you need to go back to the passage, it means that you've not understood what the author is trying to say. So what I try to do is I try to eliminate the options, okay, rather than selecting the best option. So I will try to eliminate A, B, C, and D and see that which one I cannot eliminate, that will be our answer. So first, incorporating principles from rhetoric into aesthetics and into visual design would create the best possible way of evaluating modern communication. Now, this is a straight reject because aesthetics has a negative tone attached to it. The author will never admit that making some improvement to aesthetics will improve the way we understand rhetoric or how we can evaluate modern communication. So it is a straight reject. That is why I was saying that the only thing you need to understand is the tone that the author is ascribing towards the field of aesthetics. The second is a combination of rhetorical analysis and visual message design principles will help critics and consumers to better understand an evolving visual world. Now, recall that the author has made this point. He has impressed on us that the study of rhetorical analysis and the visual message will help us make sense of the bombardment of the visual messages we are getting and how we can evaluate this evolving visual world. So this can be the answer. If we are able to eliminate C and D, then B is most probably the answer because we did not find any problem with B. Now, coming to the third option, the existing rhetorical analysis and image design studies are inadequate for communication studies to explain the imagery that persuades us every day. Now, again, the only negative tone that the author attached was for aesthetics. Nowhere in the passage has he said that this field of study is inadequate or this is inappropriate or something. So again, you can completely eliminate this. Option D, as the area of visual rhetoric develops and evolves, the approaches that critics take in evaluating contemporary text and images must be scrutinized. Again, we saw that the author did not have any negative tone attached to any critics or their approaches. So he would not propose that their approaches should be scrutinized. The only thing he wants to be scrutinized is that how aesthetics would affect visual rhetoric. So the answer that I would have chosen here is B without going back to the passage. So yes, B is the correct answer here. Now let's move on to the next question. According to the second paragraph, which of following is not true? Now, this I would have to go back to the passage. Without reading the passage, I was trying to eliminate some question. The current conception of rhetoric is controversial. So I don't believe that the author anywhere said that the current conception of rhetoric is controversial, but still, we'll go back and then we'll see to it. Rhetorical analysis traditionally dealt with verbal communication. Now, if you remember, the author has clearly mentioned it somewhere that the evolution was from verbal to visual. So I think B is most probably true. So it is not the answer. See, rhetoric is now the spirit of works of art and installation. Now, again, this is a bit vague option, but author has said that there were talks about marble, ink, yeah. So I think C will also not be the answer because it is true in some sense. It would require you to apply inference of a higher degree, but still you can infer that rhetoric is the spirit of arts and installation, where there are inks, there are marble, there are other forms of visual communication. Let's come to D. Rhetorical analysis currently extends to visual imagery and symbol. Coming to D is definitely not the answer because it is true. The author has clearly mentioned that it currently does extend to visual imagery and symbols. Symbols is clearly mentioned and visual imagery is also mentioned in the passage. So this controversy has not been ascribed to visual rhetoric as such. It has not been mentioned that visual rhetoric is associated with controversy. Now, if a person reads this term controversy here, he would directly eliminate A as the option. But this public controversy is not directly associated with visual rhetoric anywhere. So according to me, the answer here should be A. Okay, so the answer is A. And let's move on to the next question. The claim that visual rhetoric shortchanges public argument is most likely based on which of the following reasons? Again, I said that we do not need to know the meaning of short changes, but we would have to infer what short changes actually means. The context of this term, this short changes, was that the scholars were not very accepting of visual rhetoric. They thought that verbal mode of communication was the best. And so short changes refers to something negative. So that is what we would have to check here. Scholars believe that visual art and artifacts are inferior to verbal communication. Now, note that scholars only had problem with visual rhetoric, and this is a distortion of what is being said here. Nowhere has it been said that visual arts and artifacts are inferior to verbal communication. The rhetoric that is implied through visual means might be inferior according to the scholars, but they never said that a statue or something would be inferior to verbal communication. So this is a direct reject according to me. The Gestalt principles used to examine the visual have universal appeal. It does not have any negative connotation attached to it because short-changing public argument should be based on something that implies that visual rhetoric does something manipulative to people. Okay, but Gestalt principles being having a universal appeal does not have any underhanded nature attached to it. So I would not mark it as the answer. The purpose of the rhetor or designer is generally not understood by the audience. Now, this is something that I focused on before, that if the designer or the rhetor already has more knowledge than the audience, then he or she has an upper hand over the audience. So the author has not said that there is manipulation involved, but he is implying that if rhetor or designer want it, they could shortchange or they could affect public argument by manipulating them. According to me, C could be a good answer. Let's go on to option D. Imagery as a rhetorical form is tainted because it prevents critical thinking. Now, if you go back to the passage, nowhere has it been said that it prevents critical thinking. It is too extreme an option to be true. The only thing that has been said here is that it could affect critical thinking. But no, we cannot say that it would completely eliminate critical thinking. So option D is extreme and it can be directly eliminated. So the thing is that I'm not entirely sure whether C is the answer, but I'm definitely sure that the A, B, and D are not the answers. Okay, so that is why I would have gone with C. I just want to know three options that are not correct. And then the fourth would be the answer. All of the following can be inferred from the last paragraph, except. Now note that the last paragraph dealt with aesthetics, and aesthetics had a negative connotation attached to it. So we will see that which of the following attaches a positive connotation with aesthetics, and we would directly choose that as the answer. Okay. So the audience and the context of the artifact are crucial in rhetorical analysis. Now the author has impressed upon this fact. Since aesthetics does not deal with the audience or the context of the artifact, that is the reason that aesthetics is not good for rhetorical analysis. So according to the author, these two are very crucial when it comes to rhetorical analysis. Okay, so this cannot be the right answer. Second, the formal criteria of aesthetics are not useful in rhetorical evaluation of images. Again, the author has impressed this that the criteria of aesthetics, it cannot be used in rhetorical evaluation of images. And A and B, you can see that they're talking about almost the same things. Okay, so this is in line with what the author is trying to present here. See, aesthetic evaluation explains how an image is constructed to influence the audience. Now, this is a problematic answer because it attaches a positive note to aesthetics. It says that aesthetics can explain how an image is constructed to influence the audience, while author is saying that aesthetic evaluation has no bearing on visual on rhetorical analysis, that it is useless when it comes to rhetorical analysis. So C cannot be inferred from the last paragraph, according to me. But let's move on to option D. Aesthetic judging is lacking in the evaluation of the visual rhetoric message. Again, A, B, and C are actually saying almost the same thing, that aesthetic judging is not very good when it comes to interpreting rhetorical messages or doing rhetorical analysis. So A, B, and D are in line with author's tone, and C is the only thing that attaches a positive note to aesthetic evaluation, and I would have chosen C as the answer directly. Okay, so C is the answer. Key takeaways for RCs. So, as you saw me do, you should eliminate, not select. Because if you read only one option, then you would see that it is almost correct and you would not be able to interpret what is the problem here. So the first thing that you should do is you should try to see why this option can be wrong, and then you would have three options that are wrong and fourth will be the answer. Do not panic if the RC is from a topic that is far from your comfort zone. If you don't read philosophy, if you don't know the important terms, just substitute rhetoric for XYZ and then try to read the whole paragraph. Okay, you do not need to know the meaning of everything. You just have to understand what the author is trying to convey to you, and that can be done without knowing the meaning of each and every jargon. Knowing the meaning of every word isn't important. Again, what I have done many times while solving this paragraph, I did not know the meaning of every word, but still I was able to come up with an answer. Focus on accuracy rather than attempting all questions till you develop expertise. The thing is that there is a very love hate relationship between accuracy and number of attempts. If your number of attempts go up, generally your accuracy falls down. So you should gradually increase your number of attempts while keeping your accuracy constant. So the first focus here should be on accuracy, and then gradually you should try to increase your attempts. Don't run away from dry and long passages. Sometimes you see that this is a very boring passage, I should leave it and attempt a more engaging or something that I'm very familiar with. But most of the time it backfires because that bland passage might have very easy questions attached to it. If you are very short on time, I would suggest that if you have to choose between two, don't only read the passage, don't only have a look over the passage, but also see what type of questions are being asked. If there are all fact based questions, even though it is a bland passage, go ahead and attempt that.